Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It's not a modern problem establishing that a potential sexual partner is happy to become an actual one. Fumbling away through the flirting, the come-ons or the rejections is part of growing up. But the issue of sexual consent has never been as charged as it is today. In fact, an app has come along to help would-be partners make explicit their permission to proceed in a form of contract. The fact that it describes itself as secured in the blockchain will either inspire confidence or scepticism of that idea. But whether the app takes off, is this kind of formal contracting process, explicit consent, seriously the answer to the many cases of disputed consent or confused intentions? What kind of consent should people be comfortable with? Well, I'm joined by Kate Parker, a barrister who'd set up a charity called the Schools Consent Project, which sends lawyers into schools to discuss issues relating to consent and sexual offences. Very good evening to you.
Good evening.
Some of this is motivated by what's happening in Sweden, and maybe you can tell us, because they've passed a law that effectively says explicit consent is required. Is that right?
Yes, it's exactly that. And I premise this by saying I'm not a Swedish lawyer, I'm an English lawyer,
but
their law has done a U-turn. So originally, as I understand it, it was that for a rape prosecution or rape conviction, it had to be that there were threats of violence, and obviously there were lots of circumstances where someone can be violated without that being present. That's now moved to a position where there has to be explicit verbalised consent. Failing that,
right.
A conviction for rape or sexual assault.
And I mean, at least a verbal is acceptable in that circumstance. What do you think of the idea of an app where you literally, I think it involves a photo and you tap a heart and you can tick various boxes for consenting to this or that and not this or that?
I think the app creators are probably coming from the right place. I think the app is problematic in a number of ways. I think that anything that purports to externalise and commodify consent, some hours possibly before any sexual interaction takes place, is a worry, because consent is obviously a live thing. It involves two human beings checking in with one another.
It's a process, isn't
exactly.
it? It's not. You don't give a licence for 4 hours for anything you want.
You might give a licence for one thing, and in actual fact, what happens in the bedroom turns out to be something completely different.
Yes, exactly.
So I think the app is unworkable, but as I say, I think trying to open up conversations about consent, as my charity does, is an important thing to do.
But you're a bit sceptical about requiring explicit verbal consent, or not? I mean, because one just thinks of situations where people fumble their way through very awkwardly, really.
Yes, from a legal perspective. I mean, my issue, going back to Sweden's law, is that it almost reverses the standard and burden of proof. Obviously, there are scenarios where you read someone's non-verbal cues and you're able to understand that they're consenting. For example, a couple that might have been together, I don't know, 10, 20 years, is unlikely to check in with one another that explicitly and say, do you consent to this, do you consent to that? So certainly there can be consensual sexual interactions that don't require or need verbalised consent.
You run the Schools Project. What is your advice to young people about how to engage in this? Because it can just be so awkward and embarrassing, and there are so many other tensions that you're trying to overcome.
Absolutely, there might be alcohol involved, nervousness, whatever it might be. Communication, we say, is the answer. That doesn't need to be saying, do you consent to this?
Because you don't want it to be a turn-off, right? I mean, so what is the communication?
Well, something like, does this feel good to you? Something like that. Does this feel right? What do you like? Opening up those channels of communication, we say, is really, really important for young people. Even just discussing it in a classroom in the cold light of day, so that they have some kind of pre-thinking before they find themselves in these scenarios, we think is very important for them.
Just to put the other side, though, 99.9% of cases will be dealt with perfectly finely on that kind of basis. There will be 0.1 or some number where there will be a disputed consent. And maybe you do just need to go the Swedish way, because those ones are so awful that you just have to say, look, everyone else has to go with explicit consent that we can deal with the 0.1 that are not explicit.
Yeah, I mean, turning kind of to our law on consent, Our law says that a person consents if he or she agrees by choice and has the freedom and capacity to make that choice. As I understand it, there's no current feeling that that law should change, but certainly what we say when we go into classrooms is your own personal standard might need to be a bit higher than that.
You might,
exactly, you might want
good
to
etiquette.
Enthusiasm rather than just capacity, for example.
Kate Barker, thanks very much.
Thank you.